Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by Peter Lamont. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Ali. How are you?
I'm really well, thanks. I'll give you the introduction. Peter Lamont is a professor of history and theory of psychology at the University of Edinburgh and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He's also a former professional magician and associate of the Inner Magic Circle. We'll get to most of those things, I think, but we're here to talk about your book, Radical Thinking: How to See the Bigger Picture. I have my copy here, which I'm showing to the camera for our video version. But to give people a bit of background, Peter, you and I did an event at I Write about the book recently, and I had so many questions that we just didn't get to. So I thought, well, let's get some of those answers today. First question I want to ask is, why did you want to write Radical Thinking?
That's a very good question. So it came out of a course that I taught at Edinburgh University a few years ago. And the reason for the course was that I thought the way things are, we need more critical thinking than we've got. And I wasn't entirely happy, just personally, with the way that critical thinking was being presented. I thought it wasn't critical enough. So I came up with a course which I taught here in Edinburgh, and it was very much based on how we look at the world, and it involved a lot of local things. And the idea was that the students, when they left, they would find the world more interesting than when they walked in. That was the main, what we call learning outcome. There was no test, there was no assessment. It was
Right.
all about curiosity, finding the world more interesting. It was an optional course because there was no credit for it. And I thought that's what we need before you can do any critical thinking at all. You first have to be curious, because if you're not curious, you're not going to ask any questions. You're not going to think critically. So that's where it began. And it was surprisingly popular. It involved a whole bunch of things, not your normal lectures. And but then COVID came, and I couldn't do it because it was very much a live thing. So what happened was I decided to turn it into a book, and that then became what's called radical thinking.
So that's interesting. It kind of touches on some of the way the book is written. It's very local, so much so that I don't know where you're sitting now. You're at the university now.
I'm at home just now.
You're at home just now, but it begins, doesn't it, in the kind of environs of your office almost.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the basic idea was that to make sense of the world, we've got to start from where we are. All of us look at the world from a certain position, from a certain perspective. We can only see the world from where we are, but we can be more curious about how we do that. And so that's what I decided to do. I thought I'll look at the world from where I am, but I'll be more curious about it. And so I actually started in my office looking out the window, because when you're an academic, looking out the window counts as work. And and from there, I just started wandering around. But again, it went back to the course. The course was so that the students, when they walk out the building, would look at the world in a different way. So that's why the Edinburgh focus. But I suppose I should say you don't have to know anything about Edinburgh to get it. I've deliberately chosen ideas that are known well beyond Edinburgh.
No, no, absolutely. You can apply it to anywhere, and that's one of the ways that the book works really well. But it does answer the question of, I can see students seeing the city that they're in, some of them perhaps only recently arriving, and seeing it in a slightly different way.
Exactly, yeah, that's it. But also those who, like me, I'm from here. I was born here. So what you find as you walk along the streets, and this is the same in Glasgow or London or anywhere else, you're constantly passing things that you haven't really noticed before. And part of the critical thinking thing is about noticing things that you haven't noticed before. And that has to be a change in approach, a change in attitude.
So, in your mind, is there a difference between critical thinking and radical thinking, or is radical thinking just amping it up a little bit?
Kind of. So the reason for that is because when I started, before I did the course, I did some research on the history of critical thinking. And what you find is there's a kind of shift in the 20th century in terms of what critical thinking is. So basically, critical thinking is meant to be about how you think, not what you think.
Mhm.
Whatever you think, it's not about where you end up, it's about how you get there.
Yeah.
What happened over the 20th century is it became increasingly about where you end up and what you think. And that for me is the problem. So for anyone who knows the critical thinking literature, it became more and more about getting it right.
Hmm.
I wanted to get away from that because a lot of the time we're arguing about what's right. And if we think we've got it right, then we're not going to understand someone else because we'll
Yeah.
think they're wrong. So it needs to be about how we get there, not where we end up. And that meant just giving it a slightly different name. And radical, well, radical comes from the Latin radic, meaning root. So radical thinking is thinking about the roots, the foundations of our beliefs. And that's what I want to get at, these things that shape our thoughts. Whatever we think about anything, our thoughts are shaped by various things that we don't see because they're in the ways that we look at the world.
And so this, a, a lot of the things that you look at are related to places and ideas and beliefs in the world today. Was that a kind of inspiration? What you saw was happening today in terms of thinking?
Yeah, I suppose it's not giving too much away to say that probably about 10 years ago now, it seems like longer, doesn't it? But roughly 10 years ago, I think a lot of us began to think, what the hell's going on? Things that seem to be more orderly, things seem to be more rational. We seem to have a sense of it. And then things happen that we just didn't expect. I don't think I'm alone here. So part of it was that none of it's new. Whatever we think critical thinking is or uncritical thinking, it's all been going on for a very long time. But there are moments where things just seem to be getting worse. And I think early 21st century, partly with the rise of the internet, with this constant flow of information, often unreliable information, with competing views, with competing facts, it's very hard to make sense of what's going on. And part of the problem, I think, is that we've quickly become polarized because we focus on one thing in particular and
Yeah.
we end up on different sides of it. And the only way to make sense of that is to get back to how we got there in the first place. So it's kind of a stepping back from the noise and the confusion to see how we end up coming to any conclusions at all.
I mean, one of the important things in the book is to for people to engage with people who have different points of view, who maybe, are thinking in a different, maybe not thinking in a different way, but have beliefs that maybe you do not share, rather than just saying, cutting them off and saying, well, you don't believe the same as me, therefore I'm retreating to my group who all believe the same as me. And I think that, particularly online, seems to be what's happened.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, in terms of the foundation of what we think, so one example would be that whatever we think about anything at all, it's based on what we notice.
Yeah.
If we notice something, it won't cross our minds. However, even though everything we think is based on what we notice a fraction of what's going on. And then what we do notice, we have to interpret it because we don't see anything as it really is. We always interpret what we see, but we can always interpret things in different ways. So everything we think is based on what we notice and how we interpret it. People notice different things, they interpret them in different ways, and they end up with different beliefs, different worldviews. We shouldn't be surprised by that. But even though we end up in different places, we get there through a similar process, through noticing certain things and interpreting them in a certain way. And if we want to see past our own view, which is always limited by what we notice, how we
Yeah.
interpret it, then we need to think about the bigger picture beyond that. What about all the things we haven't noticed? What about other ways of interpreting things? And that's where other people become a resource
And
because they've noticed other things and they've interpreted them in different ways. So they can help us see the bigger picture beyond our own limited view.
yeah, and I was thinking as I was reading the book about the term culture wars, and wars always seems to say that you've got two sides or two viewpoints clashing, and therefore with the way people are engaging in culture wars at the moment, that's problematic in itself. That idea that never the twain shall meet unless they're doing battle.
Well, but exactly. So again, you think about how we make sense of the world. All of us, whatever we think, we make sense of it. We don't just see it as it is. How do we make sense of the world? We organize it into some sort of order, right? We look for similarities. We group things together. We tease things apart. We draw boundaries between this and that. And that's how we make sense of the world. But we can always draw different boundaries, right? We can create different categories depending on where we draw the boundaries. So what happens in terms of culture wars, other kinds of polarization, is that somebody else has framed the debate. They've framed the debate and they've drawn a boundary right down the center and
Yeah,
they pick a side. And so we end up in different sides. But we're only on different sides of that boundary. You draw different boundaries, we'll end up in the same side, maybe.
yeah,
Depends on the boundary we draw. But there's countless boundaries. So the problem is, as I see it, and I'm not alone here, is that other people, for whatever reason, are drawing particular boundaries to get us to pick a side. It's
yeah.
not a new idea, is it?
No,
But
absolutely
but
not.
the more we focus on that, the more we focus on the boundary they draw, the more we're going to end up on different sides.
And saying it's not a new idea in the book itself, you kind of include historical figures and their ideas. Why did you look at? I know these, and they're also related to Edinburgh, so there is that part of it. I know, but why did you want to look at these characters? I mean, I think you've got Houdini, you've got a fabulous couple, got the Davenports, who I didn't know anything about. Could you talk a little bit about those characters and why you've included them in the book?
Well, part of it is, write about what you know. So I've studied mostly the history and psychology of magic and the paranormal, and that includes, amongst other things, beliefs about magic and the paranormal. So I've written quite a lot about that, and because beliefs, what I call extraordinary beliefs, so many people would say paranormal or supernatural, but it's the same kind of thing. Extraordinary, paranormal, supernatural, beyond the usual thing. So when you look at that stuff, you can see the way that people argue about on both sides of a particular debate. And what's interesting is that the arguments people have about extraordinary things are really not so different from the way we argue about ordinary things.
Right.
The difference is that when people make an extraordinary claim, they're more explicit. So, if I said I believe in horses, you probably would go, I don't know why he's telling me that, but you wouldn't be looking for anything more. But if I say I believe in unicorns, you're going to want to know more than that, right? So if I say, well, I saw a unicorn just out the window, I'm not going to just say that. I'm going to say other things. I'm going to justify that position. I'm not kidding. I'm not making it up. I'm not lying. I'm honest. I'm quite sane. I'm sober. I'm not on anything. It's not just me, other people have seen it, and so on. So you do all these justifications because you need to, because it's an extraordinary thing and people don't buy it otherwise. The point is, with ordinary beliefs, it's really much the same. It's just we don't say these things. So these things are implicit and we don't see them, we don't notice them, we don't notice them, we think we're just seeing the world the way it is. So the extraordinary stuff is a really useful way to get into the ordinary stuff. And also because I've done a lot of work on this, it's handy. I know what I can do with it as we, in terms of using it to illustrate certain ways about how we think.
And going back to your own time as a magician, is that something that magicians use? They understand that. They understand that there are certain things people take for granted, and therefore you can use them to. I'm not trying to get any magic circle secrets here, Pete, but I'm just interested in, there's a couple of incidents in the book. The one I'm thinking about was the person dressed as the gorilla who walked through the room, and people say that they didn't notice it. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a famous experiment from the 90s, 1990s, I should say, which many people have seen. I don't want to ruin it for them
Yeah,
if they haven't seen it. So I'll try and say this without ruining. I'm not sure I can actually. Anyway, basically, someone's watching a screen. They're watching a bunch of people playing a game of basketball, and at some point, uh, somebody wearing a gorilla suit walks along, and people don't notice the gorilla, and so they call this inattentional blindness, which is an example of how even though something's right in front of us, we don't notice it.
yeah,
The curious thing about it is that as a magician, when I first saw it, I thought, well, I know that. Magicians depend, for centuries, magicians depend on you not noticing things and uh, and expecting to have noticed them. And the gorilla thing, well, yeah, but it's not actually a gorilla, it's a
yeah,
person in a gorilla
yeah,
suit who's in the middle of other people. If it was an actual gorilla, people would have noticed. It would have
yeah.
been a very different video. So, so magicians understand that you can talk and you can do things and people won't notice them. In the same sense, that if I switched off the camera now and said, what color of jacket or shirt am I wearing, you probably wouldn't know because you've been staring at it, but it's not
Yeah.
registered because it hasn't seemed relevant. So yes, magicians have depended on these kinds of things and what we notice and on what we assume, what we just don't think of, in order for the tricks to work.
A slight diversion. Did you, which came first? Your interest in magic or your interest in the thinking about magic, if you like, and the history and all of those things, the psychology?
Well, I mean, I was into magic as a kid, so I got into magic when I was about 12. And then for a few years, I loved it as a hobby. Then I got to a certain age where, other things are more interesting.
Yeah,
And then got back into it in the 80s when I used to work at British Rail and I was doing night shifts. And then I went traveling. It's a great hobby for traveling. So that's when I got back into it. And then when I came back to Edinburgh, I decided to go to university initially to become a teacher, but I needed money. So I began to work as a magician just to pay the bills. So that was the first thing. And then later, this opportunity came up to do some work in the psychology of magic, and that's how I ended up in a psychology department.
yeah. It's a fascinating journey. Going back to some of the characters, I think people maybe didn't know, I certainly didn't know, that Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini were pals.
Yeah, they knew each other fairly well, and obviously didn't agree on everything.
Well, that's the interesting thing, Arthur Conan Doyle, who we think, obviously Sherlock Holmes and rational thinking, if you like, critical thinking, whatever you want to call it. But he himself was more flexible, perhaps, than his famous creation.
Yeah, flexible's a good word. So I mean, yes. So he created Sherlock Holmes, who was the kind of archetype rational thinker, who was somebody who noticed every detail. Whereas Dr. Watson, he misses things, and Holmes gives Watson a hard time for failing to notice things. And of course, we read this and think, well, we are more like Dr. Watson than Sherlock Holmes, and we are. We're quite right. We are because nobody. Holmes is a fictional character.
Yeah,
We don't notice everything. We can only notice some things, and what we notice depends on what we think is relevant. So there's this fictional character, Sherlock Holmes, created by Arthur Conan Doyle. The inspiration for Sherlock Holmes was a surgeon in Edinburgh called Joseph Bell. And Joseph Bell, uh, he used to diagnose patients in a similar way. That's the story.
yeah,
But but Bell, when he read Sherlock Holmes stories, thought they were kind of, he used the word drivel. Not that they were bad stories, but they exaggerated what we can do. And of course, what Conan Doyle did, I think, was he made the mistake of thinking that because you can imagine someone noticing everything, you actually do notice everything. So he went to seances, and if he didn't spot fraud, he assumed there was no fraud.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. So the kind of irony is that Conan Doyle was like Watson, but he thought he was Sherlock Holmes.
And the changing of beliefs over time is important to acknowledge as well. There are things that were widely believed in the past that perhaps now we don't. I've forgotten the name. I wouldn't say trepanning, but it's not trepanning. What do you call the study of?
Chronology?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
That people really did believe was a thing, and I think that highlights that we've got to be open because the facts, if you like, the truth of whatever those may be, change constantly.
Yeah, I mean, phrenology was, and again, Edinburgh was the centre of phrenology for a while. And so that's one reason why I use it. But phrenology was labelled a pseudoscience. It was the first body of knowledge, as I know, that was ever called pseudoscience. But when you look at the arguments at the time, the arguments weren't really about the arguments we have now about science. The biggest problem for critics of phrenology was that it didn't leave any room for the soul.
Mhm.
A lot of folk thought it was anti-Christian. Now, people might think that now, but that's not the problem that scientists would have. The other thing, of course, is that there's a lot of things that they said that scientists would now agree with.
Yeah.
That the brain is the seat of the mind, the individual functions are located in different parts of the brain, and so on. So, yeah, it's a way to think about even the best knowledge we have, scientific knowledge, that changes over time depending on the evidence we have and how we interpret the evidence.
And it's interesting, particularly again, going back to more recent times, that some of what we took for absolute certainty in terms of beliefs seem to be regressing. I'm thinking about flat Earth theory. There was a while when there were people who were saying, "Oh, the Earth is flat." How do you know? Because I can see that I can see the horizon, and that means it. That's is that something that interested you? That there were certain things that seemed to be taking a step backwards, if that's the right way to put it.
Well, that's the way that most people saw it. So when I first started to look at extraordinary beliefs, it did begin from the same position, which was why do people believe those things? Brackets, which I think are wrong.
Yeah,
That's a problem to be solved, right? It's an answer, a question to be answered. So that's why you do research to find out. But what I found was that the answers, I didn't like the answers, right? Because the answers presuppose that they are wrong. And if you want to understand someone's belief, you can't begin from the position that they're wrong, because that's not their position. They think they're right.
yeah.
I changed the question from why do they believe these things to how do they justify those views? And that little flip allows you to look at it from their point of view, and then you can understand it. And when you get into it, when you read their views, you find that they're not quite as weird as you thought. So, I mean, flat Earth is not something I looked at,
No,
though, yeah, that comes and goes occasionally. But a lot of these things come down to who you trust.
yeah.
You know, people say things, who you're going to trust. You're going to trust science, you're going to trust the government or not. So a lot of it, there's an underlying distrust of the so-called authorities.
And that seems, again, I could be wrong with this, but it seems to be something which took hold, right at high levels in government and in other places. Don't trust experts. Experts don't know it all. Kind of trust your own thinking. What they're really saying is trust our thinking, I think. But that side of things. But I guess that's always been the case. There's always been that part of it. If people aren't thinking what the folk at the top want them to think, then they'll find ways of changing their mind, if you like.
Yeah, and there's different people at the top over time,
Yeah.
you know. There was, very, very roughly speaking, the authority was the church. Later, it was science. At different points, it's been a particular government. It might be other, cultural authorities and so on. So people tend to assume certain things. They trust certain groups until something happens that makes them change their mind, or perhaps they come from a marginal background and they see problems with the mainstream and so on. Um, I mean, one of the different things now, of course, is because of the internet, everyone has a voice. Not all voices are deep, but they are loud. And so we listen to loud voices. And the criticism of experts, part of that is a way of saying, look, I'm an expert. I've had this experience.
Yeah.
And these so-called experts, they don't know what they're talking about. So a lot of people talk about their own experience, and they may well be experts in terms of their own experience.
Yeah.
But whether their experience applies to anybody else is a whole different question.
Yeah, that almost reduces it to the individual again, rather than
Yeah,
it's any kind of shared experience. It made me think about when my granny, if it was in the paper and it was on the telly, it would have been true because
yeah,
these were things that you trusted.
yeah. I mean, the old phrase about don't believe what you read. It's an old thing that people do.
Yeah,
I'll give you one example, which I did a thing. It's years and years ago, and I was an interview with a newspaper. I don't even remember the newspaper, but they asked something about Paul Daniels and Tony Blair and deception.
right.
We're trying to make a link
Yeah,
from Magic, Paul Daniels, Tony Blair. And I said, I don't really see the connection, to be honest, but it was something to do with deception and so on. Anyway, they then printed in quotation marks something that I hadn't said. And my best friend, who's done similar things, who knows it can't be, he was sure that I had actually said it.
yeah,
I didn't say it, but
yeah.
it's a
It's in
very
quotations, yeah.
powerful thing. If you put it in quotation marks, yeah, and then you deny it, everyone denies everything now. It's tricky to get to the truth.
I think language is so interesting in terms of, you know, what what we think and what we believe. Some people break it down to what the words mean is really, central to what we think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the I don't give much advice, but so far as I give some advice, which is the which is the best I've got. It's if you want to make sense of the world, first of all, first thing, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, and yet it's the most basic thing. I find telling my students now this more than ever. It sounds so simple, but if we're going to have an argument about something, first, what are we actually talking about? And that's a question of meaning. And there's a lot of people who will say the first question should be what's the evidence? But that's the second question. The first question is what are we talking about? Because until we know what we're talking about, we don't know what the evidence would be evidence of. And you see this everywhere. People talk, they're arguing about a topic, whether it's Gaza or Ukraine or gender identity or anything controversial, or even something quite ordinary like football.
Mhm.
They seem to be talking about the same thing, but they're not. They're talking past each other because they're talking about different aspects of that thing. So I think that the very first thing has to be, if you want to make sense of what's going on, first, let's establish what we're talking about. Because there's so many people who use ambiguity to deflect, divert, and so on. And then we're now talking about something that they want to talk about.
Yeah.
So it's to me, it's like it's the first thing.
In part two of the book, you look at logic and the limits of logic, which kind of feed into what you've just mentioned. The example I'm thinking of now is you talk about I'm in George Square. And that's true at the time, but other people who don't know that there's one in Glasgow, and you might be, there's knowledge that needs to be happening, so logic is limited sometimes.
Yeah, that example actually, I traveled to Glasgow to write that sentence because I wanted to be honest about it. So basically, if people don't know, my office is in George Square in Edinburgh. There's a bigger George Square in Glasgow, and I use that to make a wee point, which is, if I remember right, uh, George Square is in Edinburgh. I'm in George Square, therefore I'm in Edinburgh.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
So logically, that sounds right. But I wrote that in Glasgow. So George Square is in Edinburgh, yeah, but there's also one in Glasgow. So if you don't know that, then you don't realize there's a problem. So that's just an example of how logic, though it's we need to get better at logic. This is not a criticism of logic, but in terms of its limits, logic doesn't deal with ambiguity. It doesn't deal with ambiguous meaning.
yeah.
And so when we're trying to be logical in the real world, we need to be tuned in to the meaning of things. And if we don't know what we mean, then we're going to think something is logical when it's not.
Yeah, because that format of argument, that logical argument, I mean, that goes way back. I think the first time I heard it was all men are mortal. Aristotle is a man, therefore Aristotle is mortal, or something along those lines. So
That's right. Yeah.
that's a kind
Yeah.
of set out argument. But so it was really interesting to see, yes, but you really do need to know more than that.
Yeah, it's called a syllogism. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of classic. I think it's more recent than Socrates, but it's linked to Socrates, which is it's that the basic idea is you've got two premises and a conclusion. If premise one is correct and premise two is correct, then does the conclusion follow? And that makes it a valid argument. But what it doesn't do is think, well, is premise one true? Like that's an empirical question. That's a different question. The idea is that take premise one to be true and premise two to be true. Does the conclusion follow from those things? But in the real world, we don't know if these things are true. And so often we're arguing about that. So logic in the real world is limited in terms of meaning and often in terms of context. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but it does mean that we've got to be careful about how we link it to real world arguments.
And going back to the very start when you talked about the importance of being curious, is that something you think some people kind of shy away from? I don't want to know.
It's funny that the words we use to describe these things, they're all obviously they have meanings and we can
Yes.
think of them as different things. But I mean, curiosity to me is what comes from an awareness that you don't know something. It's not ignorance. It's not knowing something.
Yeah.
It's an awareness that there's something you don't know, which should lead you to then want to find out.
Yeah.
But a lot of people might respond to, oh, there's something I don't know. I'm so stupid, I can't understand. The world's so confusing. So it's really about your attitude towards things you don't know. I don't think we need to be scared of alternative views. I don't think we need to see them as a threat. I think we can see them as an opportunity to learn about other ways of seeing the world. We don't need to agree with them, but we can understand how they got there. And what we do when you engage with somebody who has a very different worldview, one thing that happens if you're paying attention is that you notice they're making different assumptions from you. And that reminds you, you're actually making assumptions.
Yeah.
Because when we all make the same assumptions, we forget we're making assumptions. They're just unspoken. So part of it is that it's like travel. It's like history. You go into a different world where things work differently, and you realize, oh yeah, the way that we do things is one way to do things, but there are other ways, and you start to notice things which you didn't notice before.
The reason I asked that question is I just wondered if people have strongly held beliefs, to be curious about other people might, and they may be aware that might change that belief or at least challenge that belief, and actually they don't want that to happen. At times, I'm not, this is just a kind of generalization.
No, I think that's true. I think that's a lot of people. I'm sure it's the case with me as it is with you and everybody else. There are things what you want to have some stability. You want to believe certain things, but I mean, I've never believed in the paranormal unless you count when I was a kid. I believed in Christian miracles
Mhm.
because I was taught to. But since I was about 15. I've been an atheist and I don't believe in miracles. I've studied lots and lots. I've spent about 30 years looking at various extraordinary phenomena. I still don't believe in them. I spent a year studying theology. I was surrounded by Christians. We had lots and lots of discussions and arguments. What I found was, though, there it wasn't just me versus them. There were lots and lots of things in which they differed, and I
Yeah,
sided with one thing and with others in a different thing because there's lots of boundaries you can draw. The main thing is just just because someone has a different view from you doesn't mean you can't have a conversation with them. But this is, I think, partly again we go back to the internet, the language of the internet, of social media, the anonymity, which allows people to be ruder, more direct, more arrogant, to exaggerate more than they would if they're sitting in front of somebody. All of this makes it more difficult. But I generally find that if you're in the room with somebody, conversations are much more civil, and so you can just engage and you can respect a different point of view.
yeah. I mean, I guess that almost defines faith is that that does come down to the individual eventually, and people may think, well, we're in the same church, perhaps literally in the same church, but you find that there are still some differences in belief.
Yeah, I mean, I've met Christians who don't believe in God.
Mhm.
I've met Christians who don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Not only, and that the Bible's not true, and there's all kinds of types of Christians uh, and I would agree with many of them in some things and disagree in others, and so on. So it is literally a broad church. But if you know anything, as I'm sure you do, about the history of Scottish Christianity, there are lots and lots of divisions
Absolutely. Yeah.
on often very, very small points of doctrine. You
Yeah.
know, it's so like I say, in terms of the thinking part, stepping back, being able to see the broader picture of where all these people disagree and what the boundaries are, that gives you a better sense of what's going on than simply tying yourself to one particular view.
And do you think faith and belief are kind of inextricably linked? Even if you think I don't have faith in a religious term, no matter what you believe, there has to be some aspect of faith in it.
Oh, well, I mean, I think I say in the book, we've all got faith of one kind or another.
Yeah.
Again, it depends on what we mean by faith belief. A lot of people think of these things as being much the same. To me, faith is more of an attitude than a belief. It's a more of a feeling. It's a bit like hope and optimism. Optimism is about probability, and hope is a sense, a feeling that things will get better. It's not quite the same as a belief that they will. So I think faith is more like that. It's more a position you take towards something rather than what would say a propositional thing. Faith isn't like I believe that God exists. It's something less less propositional than that, less of a claim than that. And so, but even if you don't believe in God, you might believe in science with a big S. That broadly speaking, there's something called science, which is a way of thinking. Science is a word we use to refer to what to what hundreds of thousands of people do in various ways, but we might think of it as a thing.
Yeah.
We might think of freedom or democracy, which are invisible things, but we believe in them.
I think what an example you use in the book is national pride is one, which I'd never considered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, national pride is one of those things that people tend to have, and it's seen as a good thing. And excuse me, if you it's sometimes used for bad things. There's nothing bad about it. I watched the game the World Cup qualifying game and was making the same noises as everyone else in the country. And that's grand. But I think when national pride is, and it often is, seen as a way to pretend that we're special, it becomes an issue. And if we're going to have national pride based on a particular part of our past, heroes and inventions and all that kind of stuff, all the fine stuff that Scots have done, then we might want to think about the flip side, which is, well, there's lots of Scots have done pretty grim things in the past. Are we supposed to be ashamed of that? And we can take a position on that. We can do what we like with it, but I think that national pride is something that we easily get into, and which can be seen as a kind of faith, but it's based on a particular version of the past. And there are other versions of if we're talking about Scotland, there's other parts of Scottish history that we might be less proud of, and perhaps we should think about them too.
Pete, once again, I could talk to you for hours and hours. I'm going to finish up though with one last point, because in the book, I think you suggest that there's a danger when thinking too much about the process of thinking, you may miss out. You talk about looking at the radical road in Edinburgh rather than experiencing being on it, which is two very different things.
Yeah, well. It's funny because when I started to write the book, and I thought, oh, the Radical Road Radical Road in Edinburgh is a path that leads up Salisbury Crags near the centre of Edinburgh, and it's called the Radical Road because it was built after the Radical War of 1820, and the Radicals lost that war, and some of the people who fought on their side were used to build this path. So it's called the Radical Road, just in case people don't know the road. So this became a kind of metaphor for one of the big themes of the book. And one of the things is that if you look at what the radicals wanted, well, radicals thought that all men should have the vote, but only men. So 200 years ago, that was radical stuff. But now, of course, they weren't radical enough. So, but talking about Radical Road and perspective and so on. But the road's been closed for years now because of fear of falling rocks. So I can't walk the road, which was quite frustrating when I was writing the book. I was wanting to use it a lot more. So there's talk about it being open. There's been talk for a long time. So what you can't do is actually walk the walk.
Yeah.
And I think the point I make is that if you walk the road rather than look at it from a distance, if you actually walk it, then you notice that if you go one way, you see one thing. If you go another way, you see another. Higher up, lower up, you can look up or down. There's all kinds of things you can do in the actual process of walking the road, which you can't do simply from looking at it. And I guess I was thinking of really the difference between looking at a screen and getting out into the street and talking to people.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to leave it. Although I've, so many other things, customs and habits I wanted to talk to you about. And, there's lots of great things that it's such, because it's not a huge book, but it's such a rich and kind of so many, it really does get you thinking, which is, I guess, what you wanted to do in the first place.
Oh, that's good. Thank you. Yeah. As long as it makes people think. I don't expect everyone to agree.
Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. So it's been enjoyable.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.